AP 120 Lab 8 Nervous System. So here is a neuron. As we know, the cell bodies where you find the nucleus, there are small processes called dendrites coming off of the cell body, and then one long process called the axon that also comes off of the cell body. Here is a model. Here is the cell body. Within the cell body, the nucleus. These sebaceous stumps are the dendrites, and this is the beginning of the axon. These orangish pieces are coming from other neurons. These are the axons of other neurons ending with the synaptic knob. And so where the synaptic knob meets the dendrite, we have a synapse. And then this portion of the cell body is called the axon hillock. Here is the axon again going through the center here. And surrounding the axon is, of course, the myelin sheath. All these layers make up the myelin sheath. And this, of course, comes from the Schwann cell. So here is the nucleus of the Schwann cell. And then this little depression here, that is the node of Ranvier, or Ranvier. All right, central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. The spinal cord begins at foramen magnum. So as soon as the nervous tissue is past foramen magnum, it is now spinal cord. And then it ends around L1, L2 of the vertebra. So the spinal cord does not go all the way to the end of the vertebral canal. It stops around vertebra L1 and L2. Here is a transverse section of a spinal cord. Here's anterior side, posterior side. We can see the nerves coming off of it. So here is the spinal nerve. It splits to give us the dorsal root, and also this large lump here, which is the dorsal root ganglion. Then dorsal root again, attaching to the back of the spinal cord. And then, of course, when the spinal nerve splits, we have the ventral root going to the anterior side of the spinal cord. Then there's a little hole or space here called the central canal, filled with cerebral spinal fluid. This portion of white matter is called the posterior funiculus. Here is the lateral funiculus, and here is the anterior funiculus. So anterior funiculus, lateral funiculus, posterior funiculus. The gray matter gets broken down into the posterior horn, the lateral horn, and the anterior horn. And then this bar of gray matter that crosses and connects the right and left sides, that's called the gray commissure. So gray commissure, posterior horn, lateral horn, anterior horn. Here's the brain. The brain is normally surrounded by the meninges. On this side, we can see that the pia mater is still lying on the surface of the brain. On this side, the pia mater and the blood vessels have been removed, cleaned up as it were. When you see these folds moving up, those folds coming up are called the gyri, or one gyrus. And then the crevices going down, those grooves are called the sulci for many, or one sulcus, many sulci, one gyrus, many gyri. Gyri are the mountains, the sulci are the valleys. Here is the brain again. Here is the lateral sulcus, and then the transverse sulcus separating the cerebrum from the cerebellum. We have the longitudinal fissure, this space here separating the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. The cerebrum, of course, on the surface, we can see 4 of the 5 cerebral lobes. We have the frontal lobe, which is anterior, the parietal lobe, which is superior, the occipital lobe, which is posterior, and the temporal lobe, which is lateral. Frontal lobe, thinking, motor activity, personality. Parietal lobe for cutaneous sensations. Occipital lobe, vision. Temporal lobe, olfaction and hearing. And there is the insula, but you cannot see it on the surface. Here is the diencephalon. The diencephalon includes the corpus callosum, this long white ridge here. Underneath that is the septum pellucidum. This is a wall that separates the lateral ventricles. This area here, little I, this is the thalamus. This more cone-shaped area here is the hypothalamus. And then right at the tip of the hypothalamus is where you find the optic chiasm. Then we have, of course, the brainstem. The brainstem includes the cerebral aqueduct carrying cerebral spinal fluid that leads to the fourth aqueduct, which then leads to the central canal of the spinal cord. You can break the brainstem into the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, which then connects to the spinal cord. And then these two bumps here are part of the corpora quadrigemina, which is part of the midbrain. Here's the cerebellum in cross section. Here's an inferior view of the brain. So toward the anterior side is the frontal lobe. Here's the olfactory bulbs, the optic tracts. The optic nerves are these little stumps here and here. Here's the pituitary gland. In pink, optic nerves become optic tracts. Temporal lobes on the lateral sides. Here's the pons, medulla oblongata, cerebellum. All right, here is, of course, a mid-sagittal section of the brain where you can see all kinds of structures. You can see the gyri, the sulci, the corpus callosum, septum pellucidum, hypothalamus, thalamus, optic chiasm, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle, corpora quadrigemina, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, cerebellum. All important structures you need to be able to identify for the quiz. Now, when you look inside the cerebrum, you see that there are 4 fluid-filled chambers called the ventricles. You have the right and left lateral ventricles, each in a hemisphere. You have the third ventricle lying near the diencephalon. The cerebral aqueduct then connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, which is between the brainstem and the cerebellum. And then that, of course, connects down to the central canal of the spinal cord. Here's a lateral view. Again, the lateral ventricles, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle, and central canal. All right, reflexes. Reflexes are automatic responses. Reflexes only require the spinal cord. The brain is not required to have the reflex occur. Although the information that it occurred will get passed on to the brain is not needed. The simplest example is the monosynaptic reflexes, such as the patellar reflex. In the patellar reflex, the doctor will use a rubber mallet to hit the patellar ligament. This will stretch the quadriceps femoris group. The stretching is the sensation, the stimuli, and then the sensory neuron will carry that information to the spinal cord, where it will synapse with a motor neuron that will then send the command to the quadriceps femoris muscle group, causing the kick to occur. So only 2 neurons are involved, no brain. The brain is not needed for the patellar reflex. Again, when the stretch occurs, the hammer hitting the patellar ligament, we have the sensory neuron carrying the information to the spinal cord, synapsing with the motor neuron that then carries the command back out, causing the quadriceps femoris muscle group to contract and causing the leg to kick. Now, if you were to talk about a typical reflex arc, it would have at a minimum around 5 components. So you would have the sensory receptor that detects the stimulus. The sensory neuron carries the information to the central nervous system, or in this case, the spinal cord. Potentially 1 or more interneurons. The motor neuron that then sends the command, the response to the motor muscle, to the effector. Of course, the sensory receptor and the sensory neuron can be the same thing. And as we saw, the patellar reflex does not need interneurons. So, for example, here's the withdrawal reflex. So you step on a tack. The pain, the injury will trigger the sensory receptor, which happens to also be the sensory neuron. Sensory neuron then carries that information to the spinal cord. It will synapse with an interneuron, which will then synapse with the motor neuron that sends the command to the proper muscle group, causing the person to withdraw away, to raise the foot away from the site of pain, the tack. Now, it can get more complicated because obviously if you're walking and you step on a tack and raise the leg that has the weight of your body on it, you would just fall down. So when the sensory neuron brings the information to the interneuron, it actually can connect to lots of different motor neurons, triggering lots of different muscles to act so that you don't fall down, you just step back onto your other leg. That is it for Lab 8. Learn to recognize those parts of the brain, spinal cord, and neuron.